The moment my son told me my pension belonged to his family, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't throw him out of my house. I simply picked up the porcelain pot from the center of the table and poured him another cup of coffee. I am Beverly Sanders. I am 66 years old and I have lived in this three-bedroom home in Ohio for 32 years. My husband Richard passed away 4 years ago. He was a good man, a hardworking foreman who ensured that upon his passing, his pension would continue to support me. David, my 32-year-old son, sat across from me that Tuesday evening, nervously tapping his spoon against his mug. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, projecting an air of calculated innocence. She was the one pulling the strings, of course. I had known that for years. "Mom, we've been looking at the future." David began, avoiding my eyes. "With the kids growing up, expenses are rising. And well, that pension Dad left, $40, $500 a month is a lot for one person. Honestly, that pension belongs to this family. We think it's time to consolidate our resources." Sarah chimed in, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "It just makes sense, Beverly. You shouldn't have to worry about managing all that money at your age. We can handle it for you." I looked at them. I noted the expensive new leather handbag resting on the chair next to Sarah and the brand new smartwatch on David's wrist. They were not struggling. They were simply greedy. They were looking at my survival net as their personal upgrade fund. "Consolidate," I repeated softly, testing the word on my tongue. "Exactly." David nodded, taking my calm demeanor as agreement. "We'll set up a joint system. It'll be seamless." I didn't argue. I didn't defend Richard's memory or explain that the pension was my livelihood. I just smiled, offered them dessert, and let them think they had won. Because as they drove away that night, I already knew exactly what my first step would be tomorrow morning. By 9:00 a.m. the next day, I was enjoying my morning tea when I heard the front door unlatch. Sarah walked in without knocking, carrying a cardboard box of old toys. She had a habit of treating my house like an extension of her own storage unit, and treating me like the default caretaker for her clutter. "Morning, Beverly," she called out, dumping the box in the hallway. "I brought over some of the kids' old things. I figured we could clear out your guest room and make it a proper playroom for them. Since we'll be managing the finances together, it makes sense for the kids to spend more time here so I can pick up some part-time consulting." She was already redecorating my home and assigning me unpaid labor. I observed her walking through my living room, her eyes scanning the space as if calculating the square footage she could claim. "The guest room stays as it is." "Sarah," I replied, taking a sip of my Earl Grey. She paused, clearly unaccustomed to me pushing back. "Well, we can talk about it when David comes over this weekend to finalize the budget." She waved her hand dismissively, turned on her heel, and walked out, leaving the front door wide open. I set my mug down. I didn't call David to complain. I didn't send Sarah an angry text message. Complaining is what victims do, and I was not a victim in my own home. I walked over to the hallway table, picked up the phone, and dialed the local locksmith. An hour later, a polite young man named Toby was unscrewing the deadbolt. By noon, my house had brand new high-security locks on the front, back, and side doors. I placed the bright new silver key on my kitchen counter. The heavy, satisfying clunk of the new lock engaging was the best sound I had heard all week. Securing my front door was a necessary boundary, but securing my financial future required a trip downtown. Years ago, when David was in college, I had opened a joint checking account with him. It was meant to be an emergency fund, a small safety net containing about $12,000 of my savings that he could access if his car broke down or he had a medical issue. Over the years, I had forgotten about it, assuming the money was resting safely. After Sarah's visit, I logged into my online banking to review everything. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the transaction history of that joint account. 2 months ago, a $1 $200 withdrawal for an upscale resort. Last month, $850 at a luxury boutique. Last week, $400 at a high-end salon. They weren't using it for emergencies. They were bleeding me dry, testing the waters to see if I would notice before they made their big play for the pension. I grabbed my purse and drove straight to my bank branch. I didn't cause a scene. I walked up to the branch manager, a sensible woman named Martha, who had known me for a decade. "Martha," I said, clearly sitting at her desk, "I need to close the joint account I hold with my son immediately. I want the remaining balance transferred to a new single-owner account in my name only." Martha clicked her keyboard, verifying my identity. "Certainly, Mrs. Sanders. Since you are a primary account holder, you have full authority to do this." Within 15 minutes, the $550 that remained was safely locked behind a new account number. The old joint account was frozen, completely shut down. Any automatic payments or debit cards attached to it by David and Sarah would now bounce immediately. I declined the offer for a new debit card, opting to manage this specific fund entirely in person. The financial faucet was officially turned off. Now I just had to wait for them to notice the drought. On Thursday evening, I heard a loud, persistent rattling at my front door. I looked out the window to see David wrestling with his old spare key, looking frustrated. I took my time walking to the door, pulling it open just as he raised his fist to knock. "Mom, what's wrong with your lock?" "My key won't turn," he grumbled, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I had them changed, David." "The old ones were sticking," I replied calmly. He frowned, holding his hand out. "Well, give me the new spare. I need to be able to get in if there's an emergency." "I'll keep the only copies for now," I answered, ignoring his outstretched hand. David looked momentarily confused, but quickly shifted gears. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stapled packet of papers, sliding it onto my coffee table. Anyway, I brought the new family budget. Sarah and I stayed up late, working on this. I picked up the packet. It was a detailed spreadsheet. They had mapped out my entire monthly pension. According to their plan, the $4,500 would be direct deposited into a new joint account they controlled. In return, they had generously allocated a $600 allowance for my groceries and utilities. The rest was flagged for family growth, which included their mortgage private preschool for the grandkids and a car payment. "You see, Mom? It's for your own protection," David said, using that rehearsed, overly gentle tone. "You don't want to stress about bills. We'll handle everything." I looked at the spreadsheet, feeling a cold clarity wash over me. He was trying to put me on an allowance using the money his father worked 35 years to secure for me. "This is very detailed," I noted, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "So you'll sign the authorization form at the back?" he asked eagerly. I folded the packet and placed it on the counter. "I told you I would review it, David. I'll give you my final answer on Sunday at brunch." I just didn't tell him what form that answer would take. Saturday morning arrived with crisp sunshine. I was in the garden pruning my rose bushes when a silver SUV abruptly pulled into my driveway. Sarah hopped out, unbuckling my two grandchildren from the back seat. "Beverly," she called out, rushing up the driveway with a diaper bag. David and I snagged last-minute tickets to a wine tasting in the valley. "We need you to watch the kids until about 6. She didn't ask. She informed me. She pushed the diaper bag toward my hands, fully expecting me to drop my gardening shears and assume my role as the compliant, unpaid babysitter. I stepped back, keeping my hands at my sides. The diaper bag fell onto the grass. "I cannot watch the children today, Sarah. I have plans," I stated firmly. Sarah's jaw dropped. She looked at the bag on the ground, then back at me. "What plans?" "You didn't mention anything, Beverly. We already paid for the tickets. They're non-refundable." "Then you should have asked me before you bought them," I replied, picking up my shears and turning back to my roses. "Have a nice weekend." "You're being completely unreasonable," she yelled, her carefully constructed sweet facade cracking instantly. "This is about the budget, isn't it? You're throwing a tantrum. I didn't turn around. I snipped a dead bloom from the bush. Goodbye, Sarah. She stood there fuming for a full minute before grabbing the bag, shoving the kids back into the car, and peeling out of the driveway. My phone buzzed 10 minutes later with an angry text from David demanding to know why I had ruined their weekend. I simply swiped the notification away and put the phone on silent. They thought I was just being stubborn. They had no idea I was spending that weekend preparing a very specific stack of documents. Monday morning, I went to work. I did not need legal battles, and I did not need drama. I simply needed to solidify the walls around my life. First, I visited the county clerk's office. I had spent Sunday evening filling out standard state-approved forms for a revocable living trust. It is a simple concept. You place your assets into a trust, and you remain the sole trustee with absolute control while you are alive. I listed myself as the primary trustee. I listed my grandchildren as the sole beneficiaries upon my passing, stipulating they could not access the funds until they turned 25. David and Sarah were entirely excluded. I walked to the local bank, presented my identification, and had the trust documents notarized by the branch notary. Then, I officially transferred the deed of my house into the name of the trust. Next, I went online to the state pensions portal. I updated my security questions, changed my passwords, and downloaded the official statement showing that my $4,500 monthly benefit was locked exclusively to my newly secured single-owner bank account. Finally, I printed out the zero-balance statement from the joint checking account I had closed earlier in the week. I took all these documents, the closed account receipt, the new pension deposit confirmation, and the notarized trust showing the house was untouchable, and placed them neatly into a thick blue folder. There were no tricks. There was no complicated maneuvering. It was just cold, hard reality printed on standard white paper. I called David that evening. "Brunch is at 11 tomorrow," I said cheerfully. "Bring Sarah. We have things to finalize." I hung up before he could ask questions. Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, sharp David and Sarah walked up my driveway. I unlocked the door to let them in. They looked incredibly pleased with themselves. Sarah carried a bouquet of cheap supermarket flowers, a blatant peace offering after her driveway tantrum, while David carried his leather briefcase. "Mom, the roast smells amazing," David said, walking into the dining room. "Thank you." "Please sit down," I offered, taking the flowers and setting them on the counter without bothering to put them in water. We ate in relative silence. Sarah kept looking around the room, her eyes lingering on the antique credenza and the silver dining set. I could tell she was already taking mental inventory of what she considered her future property. She poured herself a large glass of wine, acting entirely like the lady of the house. As soon as I cleared the dessert plates, David cleared his throat. He unlatched his briefcase and pulled out the budget spreadsheet, placing it squarely in the center of the table. Beside it, he placed a black ballpoint pen. So Mom David smiled, folding his hands. "Are we ready to get this signed? The sooner we get the pension transferred to the family account, the sooner you can relax. No more worrying about bills." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "It really is the best thing for everyone, Beverly." I looked at the pen. I looked at the spreadsheet. Then I looked at my son. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I stood up, walked to the kitchen counter, and retrieved the thick blue folder. I returned to the table and slid it across the polished oak surface until it bumped gently against his spreadsheet. David frowned, looking at the blue folder. "What's this?" "We don't need any other paperwork, Mom. I've handled it." "Open it," I instructed, my voice flat and unwavering. He flipped open the cover. The first page was the bank statement from our joint checking account. His eyes scanned the numbers until they landed on the bold 0 at the bottom, right next to the word "closed." "Wait, what did you do to the emergency fund?" He stammered, his confidence faltering. I closed it, I answered simply. After noticing Sarah's spa weekend and the resort deposit, I realized you were no longer having emergencies. You were having vacations. Sarah's face flushed a deep crimson, but she kept her mouth shut. David flipped to the second page. It was the pension routing document. Mom, this says the deposit is locked to a private account. You can't do that. We need it in the consolidated fund. Turn the page, David. He turned to the final, thickest document, the notarized, revocable living trust. He read the summary page, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal descriptions. He saw the title of the house transferred out of my individual name and into the trust. He saw the beneficiary section, the grandchildren. David whispered, the color draining entirely from his face. You left the house to the kids at 25. But what about us? I'm your son. You are my son, I agreed, sitting back in my chair. Which is why I raised you to be a capable, independent adult. The house, the pension, and my savings belong to me. Upon my passing, the assets bypass you and go directly to your children. He stared at the paperwork, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on the dock, desperately searching for words. You can't do this, Sarah finally shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. That pension belongs to this family. We planned our whole year around that money. You planned your year around my money, I corrected her, my tone colder than ice. Richard worked 35 years in a steel mill for that pension. He earned it for me so I wouldn't have to depend on anyone. I will not hand over my independence to fund your lifestyle. David stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Mom, you're being crazy. You're cutting off your own son. I am cutting off your access to my wallet, David. There is a profound difference, I replied, standing up to meet his gaze. I am not your piggy bank, and I am not your free nanny. I am your mother. If you only value me for the cash I can provide, then we have nothing left to discuss. I walked over to the hallway closet and pulled out the cardboard box of old toys Sarah had dumped on me days ago. I carried it to the front door and set it on the porch. Brunch is over, I stated, opening the front door wide. Take your spreadsheet and leave my home. David looked at me, realizing for the first time in his life that I was entirely serious. There was no argument to be won, no guilt trip that would work. I held all the keys, all the accounts, and all the power. He grabbed his briefcase, shoving the blue folder inside, and stormed out past me. Sarah followed, her face twisted in fury, refusing to look at me. I handed her the box of toys as she passed. I locked the new deadbolt behind them, listening to their car speed away, feeling lighter than I had in years. 6 months have passed since that Sunday brunch. There were no dramatic apologies and no tearful fake reunions. David texted a few times, initially trying to negotiate, but I simply replied that my financial decisions were final. Eventually, he stopped asking. I did not cut my grandchildren out of my life. I established a clear boundary. I pick them up from school every other Friday, treat them to ice cream, and take them to the park. I drop them back at David's house by dinner. I control the schedule, the location, and the interaction. Sarah barely speaks to me during the handoffs, and that arrangement suits me perfectly. I haven't spent a single day crying over my son's greed. Instead, I spent my time living. I joined a local garden club, I booked a trip to Italy with 2 other widows from my neighborhood, and I sleep deeply every night knowing my future is secure. The emergency account remains closed. The trust sits safely in a fireproof safe in my bedroom. The house is quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. Sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't require screaming matches or bitter arguments. Sometimes it just requires a change of locks, a trip to the bank, and the courage to stop letting people treat you like an asset instead of a person. The pension belongs to me. It always has, and it always will.